This is a live reading of the Left Behind series. We are on book 2, which is chapter 19 today. It is the Tribulation Force, book 2. And I'll begin to read. Something big was brewing. In a clandestine meeting, Buck went to see American President Gerald Fitzhugh. The president had become a tragic figure, reduced to a mere token. After serving his country for most of 2 terms in office, he now was relegated to a suite in the executive office building and had lost most of the trappings from his previous role. Now his Secret Service protection consisted of 3 men rotating every 24 hours, and they were financed by the global community. Buck met with Fitzhugh shortly after he proposed to Chloe, 2 weeks before the scheduled wedding. The president groused that his bodyguards were really there to make sure Carpathia knew his every move. But the most shattering thing in Fitzhugh's mind was that the U.S. public had so easily accepted the president's demotion. Everyone was enamored of Nikolai Carpathia, and no one else mattered. Fitzhugh pulled Buck into a secure room and left his Secret Service agent out of earshot. The worm was about to turn, Fitzhugh told Buck. At least 2 other heads of state believed it was time to throw off the shackles of the global community. I'm risking my life telling this to an employee of Carpathia, Fitzhugh said. Hey, we're all employees of Carpathia, Buck said. Fitzhugh confided to Buck that Egypt, England, and patriotic militia forces in the U.S. were determined to take action before it was too late. What does that mean? Buck asked. It means soon, Fitzhugh said. It means stay out of the major East Coast cities. New York, Buck said, and Fitzhugh nodded. Washington, especially Washington. That's not going to be easy, Buck said. My wife and I are going to be living in New York when we're married. Not for long, you're not. Can you give me an idea of timing? That I cannot do, Fitzhugh said. Let's just say I should be back in the Oval Office within a couple of months. Buck desperately wanted to tell Fitzhugh that he was merely playing into Carpathia's hands. This was all part of the foretold future. The uprising against Antichrist would be crushed and would initiate World War III, from which would come World War famine, plagues, and the death of a quarter of the Earth's population. The double ceremony in Bruce's office 2 weeks later was the most private wedding anyone could imagine. Only the 5 of them were in the room. Bruce Barnes concluded by thanking God for all the smiles, the embraces, the kisses, and the prayer. Buck asked if he could see the underground shelter Bruce had constructed. It was barely underway when I moved to New York, he said. It's the best kept secret in the church, Bruce said, as they made their way down past the furnace room and through a secret doorway. You don't want church members to use it? Buck asked. You'll see how small it is, Bruce said. I'm encouraging families to build their own. It would be chaos if the church body showed up here in a time of danger. Buck was astounded at how small the shelter was, but it seemed to have everything they would need to survive for a few weeks. The tribulation force was not made up of people who would hide out for long. The 5 huddled to compare schedules and discuss when they might see each other again. Carpathia had devised a minute-by-minute schedule for the next 6 weeks that would have Rayford flying him all over the world, finally to Washington. Then Rayford would have a few days off before flying back to New Babylon. Amanda and I could get here from Washington during that break, he said. Buck said he and Chloe would come to Chicago then, too. Bruce would be back from a swing through Australia and Indonesia. They set the date, 4 in the afternoon, 6 weeks later. They would have a 2-hour intensive Bible study in Bruce's office and then enjoy a nice dinner somewhere. Before they parted, they held hands in a circle and prayed yet again. Father, Bruce whispered, for this brief flash of joy in a world on the brink of disaster, we thank you and pray your blessing and protection on us all until we meet back here again. Bind our hearts as brothers and sisters in Christ while we are apart. Nikolai Carpathia seemed thrilled about Rayford's marriage and insisted upon meeting his new wife. He took both her hands in greeting and welcomed her and Rayford to his opulent offices, which covered the entire top floor of the global community headquarters in New Babylon. The suite also included conference rooms, private living quarters, and an elevator to the helipad. From there, one of Rayford's crew could ferry the potent to the new airstrip. Rayford could tell that Amanda's heart was in her throat. Her speech was constricted and her smile pasted on. Meeting the most evil man on the face of earth was clearly out of her sphere of experience. Though she had told Rayford she knew a few garment wholesalers who might have fit the bill. After pleasantries, Nikolai immediately approved Rayford's request that Amanda accompany them on the next trip to the U.S. to see his daughter and new son-in-law. Rayford did not say who that son-in-law was, not even mentioning that the young newlyweds lived in New York City. He said truthfully that he and Amanda would visit the couple in Chicago. I will be in Washington at least 4 days, Carpathia said. Enjoy whatever of that time you can. And now I have some news for you and your bride. Carpathia pulled a tiny remote control from his pocket and pointed it at the intercom on his desk across the room. Darling, would you join us a moment, please? Darling, Rayford thought. No pretense anymore. Hattie Durham knocked and entered. Yes, sweetie, she said. Rayford thought he would gag. Carpathia leaped to his feet and embraced her gently as if she were a porcelain doll. Hattie turned to Rayford. I'm so happy for you and Amelia, she said. Amanda, Rayford corrected, noticing his wife stiffen. He had told Amanda all about Hattie Durham, and apparently the two were not going to become soulmates. We have an announcement, too, Carpathia said. Hattie will be leaving the employee of Global Community to prepare for our new arrival. Carpathia was beaming, as if expecting a joyous reaction. Rayford did what he could to not betray his disgust and loathing. A new arrival, he said. When's the big day? We just found out, Nikolai gave him a broad wink. Well, isn't that something, Rayford said. I didn't realize you were married, Amanda said sweetly, and Rayford fought to keep his composure. She knew full well they were not. Oh, we will be, Hattie said, beaming. He's going to make an honest woman of me yet. Chloe broke down when she read her father's email about Hattie. Buck, we have failed that woman. We have all failed her. Don't I know it, Buck said. I introduced her to him. But I know her too, and I know she knows the truth. I was right there when Daddy was sharing it with you, and she was at the same table. He tried, but we have to do more. We have to get her, somehow talk to her, and have her know that I'm a believer, just like your dad is. It doesn't seem to matter that Nikolai's pilot is a Christian, but can you imagine how long I would last as his magazine publisher if he knew I was? One of these days we have to get to Hattie, even if it means going to New Babylon. What are you going to do, Chloe? Tell her she's carrying the Antichrist child and that she ought to leave him? It may come to that. Buck stood over Chloe's shoulder as she tapped out an email message back to Rayford and Amanda. Both couples had taken to writing obscurely, not using names. Any chance, Chloe wrote, that she will come with me on the next trip to the capital? It was 7 hours later, New Babylon time, when the message was sent, and the next day they received a reply, none. Someday, somehow, Chloe told Buck, and before that baby is born. Rayford found it difficult to take in the incredible change in New Babylon since the first time he had visited following the treaty signing in Israel. He had to hand it to Carpathia and his sea of money. A lavish world capital had sprung up out of the ruins, and now it teemed with commerce, industry, and transportation. The center of global activity was moving east, and Rayford's homeland seemed headed for obsolescence. The week before his and Amanda's flight to Washington with Nikolai and his entourage, Rayford emailed Bruce at New Hope, welcoming him back from his trip and asking some questions. A few things still puzzle me about the future. A lot, actually. Could you explain for us the 5th and 7th? He didn't write seals, not wanting to tip off any interloper. Bruce would know what he meant. I mean, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 6th are self-explanatory. but I'm still in the dark about 5 and 7. We can't wait to see you. A sends her love. Buck and Chloe had settled in Buck's beautiful Fifth Avenue penthouse, but any joy normal newlyweds might have received from a place like that was lost on them. Chloe kept up her research and study on the internet, and she and Buck kept in touch with Bruce's daily via email. Bruce was lonely and missed his family more than ever. He wrote, but he was thrilled that his four friends had found love and companionship. They all expressed great anticipation of the pleasure they would enjoy in each other's company at their upcoming reunion. Buck had been praying about whether to tell Chloe of President Fitzhugh's warning about New York City and Washington. Fitzhugh was well connected and undoubtedly accurate, but Buck couldn't spend his life running from danger. Life was perilous these days, and war and destruction could break out anywhere. His job had taken him to the hottest hazard spots in the world. He didn't want to be reckless or foolishly put his wife in harm's way, but every member of the Tribulation force knew the risks. Rayford was grateful that Chloe had begun getting to know Amanda better by email. When Rayford and Amanda were dating, he had monopolized most of Amanda's time, and while the women seemed to like each other, they had not bonded other than as believers. Now, communicating daily, Amanda seemed to be growing in her knowledge of Scripture. Chloe was passing along everything she was studying. Between Bruce and Chloe, Rayford found his answers about the fifth and seventh seals. It was not pleasant news, but he hadn't expected any different. The fifth seal referred to the martyrdom of tribulation saints. In a secured mail package, Bruce sent to Chloe, who forwarded on to Rayford his careful study and explanation of the passage from Revelation which referred to the fifth seal. John sees under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. They ask God how long it will be until he avenges their deaths. He gives them white robes and tells them that first some of their fellow servants and their brethren will also be made martyred. So the fifth seal judgment cost people their lives who have become believers since the rapture. That could include any one or all of us. I say before God that I would count it as a privilege to give my life for my Savior and my God. Bruce's explanation of the seventh seal made it clear that it was still a mystery even to him. The seventh seal is so awesome that when it is revealed in heaven, there is silence for half an hour. It seems to progress from the sixth seal, the greatest earthquake in history, and serves to initiate the seven trumpet judgments, which of course are progressively worse than the seal judgments. Amanda tried to summarize for Rayford. We're looking at a world war, famine, plagues, death, the martyrdom of the saints, an earthquake, and then silence in heaven as the world is ready for the next seven judgments. Rayford shook his head, then cast his eyes down. Bruce has been warning us of this all along. There are times I think I'm ready for whatever comes, and other times when I wish the end would simply come quickly. This is the price we pay, she said, for ignoring the warnings when we had the chance. And you and I were warned by the same woman. Rayford nodded. Look here, Amanda said. Bruce's last line says, check your email Monday at midnight. Lest you find this all as depressing as I have, I am uploading a favorite verse to comfort your hearts. Bruce had sent it so it would be available to both couples just before they left for their trips to Chicago to meet up with him. It read simply, He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. Rayford shifted in the pilot's seat, eager to talk to Amanda and find out how she was faring on the grueling nonstop flight from New Babylon to Dulles International. She was spending as much of the time as she could in Rayford's private quarters behind the cockpit, but she had to be sociable enough with the rest of the contingent so as not to appear rude. That, Rayford knew, meant hours of small talk. She had already been asked about the new import-export business she was starting, but then the mood in global community one seemed to shift. During one of the few breaks Rayford shared alone with her, she said, something's up. Someone keeps bringing Carpathia printouts. He studies them and scowls and has private heated meetings. Huh, Rayford said. Could be something, could be anything, could be nothing. Amanda smirked. Don't doubt my intuition. I've learned that, he said. Buck and Chloe arrived in Chicago the night before the scheduled rendezvous with Tribulation Force. They checked into the Drake Hotel and called New Hope to leave a message for Bruce, telling him they had arrived and that they would see him the following afternoon at 4. They knew from his emails that he was back in the States from his Australia-Indonesia trip, but they had heard nothing from him since. They also emailed him that Rayford and Amanda were going to come to the Drake for lunch the next day and that the 4 of them would travel to Mount Prospect together that afternoon. If you want to join us for lunch in the Cape Cod room, we'd be delighted, Buck had written. A couple of hours later, when they still had received no response to either the email or the phone message, Chloe said, "What do you think it means?" "It means he's going to surprise us at lunch tomorrow." "I hope you're right." "Count on it," Buck said. "Then it won't really be a surprise, will it?" The phone rang. "So much for surprises," Buck said. "That has to be him." But it wasn't. Rayford had illuminated the eastern seatbelt sign and was 5 minutes from touchdown at Dulles when he was contacted through his earphones by one of Carpathia's communications engineers. "The potentate would like a word with you." "Right now? We're close to final approach." "I'll ask." A few seconds later he came back. "In the cockpit with you alone after engine shut down. We have a post-flight checklist with the first officer and the navigator." "Just a minute," the engineer sounded peeved. When he came back on, he said, "Run the other 2 out of there and shut down and do the post-flight jazz after your meeting with the potentate." "Roger," Rayford muttered. "If you recognize my voice and will talk to me, call me at this payphone number and make sure you call from a payphone." "Affirmative," Buck said. He hung up and turned to Chloe. "I've got to run out for a minute." "Why? Who was that?" "Gerald Fitzhugh." "Thank you, gentlemen, and forgive me for the intrusion," Carpathia said as he passed the first officer and navigator on his way into the cockpit. Rayford knew they were as annoyed as he at the breach of procedural protocol, but then Carpathia was the boss, was he ever? Carpathia slipped deftly into the co-pilot chair. Rayford imagined that along with all his other gifts, the man would probably learn to fly a jet in an afternoon. "Captain, I feel the need to take you into my confidence. Our intelligence has discovered an insurrection plot, and we are being forced to circulate false itineraries for me in the United States." Rayford nodded, and Carpathia continued. "We suspect militia involvement and even collusion between disgruntled American factions and at least 2 other countries. To be on the safe side, we are scrambling our radio communications and telling the press conflicting stories of my destinations." "Sounds like a plan," Rayford said. "Most people think I will be in Washington for at least 4 days, but we are now announcing that I will also be in Chicago, New York, Boston, and perhaps even Los Angeles over the next 3 days." "Do I hear my little vacation slipping away?" Rayford said. "On the contrary, but I do want you available on a moment's notice." "I will leave word where I can be reached. I would like you to fly the plane to Chicago and have someone you trust return it to New York the same day." "I know just the person," Rayford said. "I'll get to New York somehow, and we can leave the country from there on schedule. We're just trying to keep the insurrectionists off balance." "Hey," Buck said when President Fitzhugh picked up on the first ring. "It's me." "I'm glad you're not at home," Fitzhugh said. "Can you tell me more?" "Just that it's good you're not at home." "Gotcha. When can I return home?" "That could be problematic, but you'll know before you head back that way. How long are you away from home?" 4 days." "Perfect." Click. "Hello, Mrs. Halliday." "Yes. Who's—" "This is Rayford Steele calling for Earl. But please don't tell him it's me. I have a surprise for him." In the morning, Buck took a call from one of the women who helped out in the office at New Hope. "We're a little worried about Pastor Barnes," she said. "Ma'am?" "He was going to surprise y'all by coming down there for lunch. We thought he might, but he picked up some kind of bug in Indonesia, and we had to get him to the emergency room. He didn't want us to tell anyone because he was sure it was something they could fix real quick and he could still get down there. But he slipped into a coma. A coma? Like I said, we're a little worried about him. As soon as the Steels get here, we'll head out there. Where is he? Northwest Community Hospital in Arlington Heights. We'll find it, Buck said. Rayford and Amanda met Earl Halliday at O'Hare at 10 that morning. I'll never forget this, Ray, Earl said. I mean, it's not like carting around the potentate himself or even the president, but I can pretend. They're expecting you at Kennedy, Rayford said. I'll give you a call later to see how you liked flying her. Rayford rented a car and Amanda answered a call from Chloe. We have to pick them up and go straight to Arlington Heights. Why? What's up? Buck and Chloe were waiting at the curb in front of the Drake when Rayford and Amanda pulled up. After quick embraces all around, they piled into the car. Northwest Community is on Central, right, Chloe? Rayford said. Right, let's hurry. Despite their concern for Bruce, Rayford felt a little more whole. He had a four-person family again, a new wife and a new son. They discussed Bruce's situation and brought each other up to date, and though they were all aware that they were living in a time of great danger for the moment, they simply enjoyed being together again. Buck sat in the back seat with Chloe, listening. How refreshing to be with people who were related and yet loved each other, cared about each other, respected one another. He didn't even want to think about the small-minded family he had come from. Somehow, someday, he would convince them they were not the Christians they thought they were. Had they been, they would not have been left behind as he was. Chloe leaned against Buck and slipped her hand into his. He was grateful she was so casual, so matter of fact about her devotion to him. She was the greatest gift God could have granted him since his salvation. What's this? He heard Rayford say. And we've been making such good time. Rayford was trying to exit onto Arlington Heights Road off the Northwest Tollway. Chloe had told him that would put them close to Northwest Community Hospital. But now local and state police and global community peacekeepers were directing a snarl of traffic past the exits. Everything came to a standstill. After a few minutes, they were able to creep forward a little. Rayford rolled down his window and asked a cop what was happening. Where have you been, pal? Keep it moving. What does he mean? Amanda reached for the radio. What are the news stations on? Chloe. Chloe moved away from Buck and leaned forward. Hit AM, then try 1, 2, and 3, she said. One of those should be traffic. They stopped again, this time with a global community peacekeeper right next to Buck's window. Buck lowered it and flashed his global community weekly press pass. What's the trouble down there? Militia had taken over an old Nike base to store contraband weapons. After the attack on Washington, our boys wiped them out. The attack on Washington? Rayford said, craning his neck to talk to the officer. Washington, D.C.? Keep moving, the officer said. If you need to get back this way, you can get off at Route 53 and try the side streets, but don't expect to get near that old Nike base. Rayford had to keep driving, but he and Buck hollered questions at every officer they passed while Amanda kept looking for a local station. Every one she tried carried the emergency broadcast system tone. But it put it on scan, Chloe suggested. Finally, the radio found an EBS station, and Amanda locked it in. The cable news network, Global Community Network, radio correspondent was broadcasting live just outside Washington, D.C. The fate of global community potent Nikolai Carpathia remains in question at this hour as Washington lies in ruins, he said. The massive assault was launched by East Coast militia with the aid of the United States of Britain and the former sovereign state of Egypt, now part of the Middle Eastern Commonwealth. Potent Carpathia arrived here last night and was thought to be staying in the presidential suite of the Capitol, but eyewitnesses say that luxury hotel was leveled this morning. Global community peacekeeping forces immediately retaliated by destroying a former Nike center in suburban Chicago. Reports from there indicate that thousands of civilian casualties have been reported in surrounding suburbs, and a colossal traffic tie-up is hampering rescue efforts. Oh, dear God, Amanda prayed. Other attacks we know about at this moment, the reporter went on, include a foray of Egyptian ground forces toward Iraq, obviously intending a siege upon New Babylon. That effort was quickly eliminated by global community air forces, which are now advancing on England. This may be a retaliatory strike for Britain's part in the American militia action against Washington. Please hold. Please stand by. Potent Carpathia is safe. He will address the nation via radio. We will stand by here and bring that to you as we receive it. We've got to we've got to get to Bruce, Chloe said, as Rayford inched along. Everybody's going to be taking 53 North, Dad. Let's go south and double back. It'll be another few moments before Potent Carpathia comes on, the reporter said. Apparently, the GCN is ensuring that his transmission cannot be traced. Meanwhile, this news out of Chicago regarding the strike against the former Nike base, it appears to have been preemptive as well as retaliatory. Global community intelligence today uncovered a plot to destroy Potent Carpathia's plane, which may or may not have contained Carpathia when it was flown to O'Hare International this morning. That plane is now airborne, destination unknown, though global community forces are marshaling in New York City. Amanda grabbed Rayford's arm. We could have been killed. When Rayford spoke, Buck thought he might break down. Let's just hope I didn't fulfill Earl's dream by getting him killed, he said. You want me to drive, Rayford? Buck asked. No, I'll be all right. The radio announcer continued. We're on standby for a live feed. A live feed from Global Community Potent Nikolai Carpathia. He had that right the first time, Chloe said. Meanwhile, this word from Chicago. GC Peacekeeping Forces spokesman said the destruction of the old Nike base was effected without the use of nuclear weapons, and though they regret heavy civilian casualties in nearby suburbs, they have issued the following statement. Casualties should be laid at the feet of the militia underground. Unauthorized militia forces are illegal to start with, but the folly of mustering arms in a civilian area has literally blown up in their faces. There is, we repeat, no danger of radiation fallout in the Chicago area, though peacekeeping forces are not allowing automobile traffic near the site of the destruction. Please stand by now for this live feed from Potent Nikolai Carpathia. Rayford had finally exited south onto Route 53, snaked his way through an authorized vehicle-only turnaround, and was heading north towards Rolling Meadows. Loyal citizens of the global community came the voice of Carpathia. I come to you today with a broken heart, unable to tell you even from where I speak. For more than a year, we have worked to draw this global community together under a banner of peace and harmony. Today, unfortunately, we have been reminded again that there are still those among us who would pull us apart. It is no secret that I am, always have been, and always will be, a pacifist. I do not believe in war. I do not believe in weaponry. I do not believe in bloodshed. On the other hand, I feel responsible for you, my brother, or my sister in this global village. Global community peacekeeping forces have already crushed the resistance. The death of innocent civilians weighs heavy on me. But I pledge immediate judgment upon all enemies of peace. The beautiful capital of the United States of North America has been laid waste, and you will hear stories of more destruction and death. Our goal remains peace and reconstruction. I will be back at the secure headquarters in New Babylon in due time and will communicate with you frequently. Above all, do not fear. Live in confidence that no threat to global tranquility will be tolerated and no enemy of peace will survive. As Rayford looked for a route that would get him near Northwest Community Hospital, the CNN GCN correspondent came back on. This late word, anti-global community militia forces have threatened nuclear war on New York City, primarily Kennedy International Airport. Civilians are fleeing the area and causing one of the worst pedestrian and auto traffic jams in the city's history. Peacekeeping forces say they have the ability and technology to intercept missiles, but are worried about residual damage to outlying areas. And now this from London. A 100 megaton bomb has destroyed Heathrow Airport, and radiation fallout threatens the populace for miles. The bomb was apparently dropped by peacekeeping forces after contraband Egyptian and Britain fighter bombers were discovered rallying from a closed militia airstrip near Heathrow. The warships, which have all been shot from the sky, were reportedly nuclear equipped and en route to Baghdad and New Babylon. It's the end of the world, Chloe whispered. God help us. Maybe we should just try to get to New Hope, Amanda suggested. Not till we check on Bruce, Rayford said. He asked a stunned passerby if it was possible to get to Northwest Community Hospital on foot. It's possible, a woman said. It's right past that field and over the rise, but I don't know how close they'll let you get to what's left of it. It was hit? Was it hit, mister? It's just up the road and across the street from the old Nike base. Most people think it got hit first. I'm going, Rayford said. Me too, Buck said. We're all going, Chloe insisted, but Rayford held up a hand. We're not all going. It's going to be hard enough for one of us to get past security. Buck or I will have a better chance because we have global community identification. I think one of us with an ID should go and the other should stay with the wives. We all have to be with someone who can't get past the red tape if necessary. I want to go, Buck said, but you make the call. Stay and make sure the car is positioned so we can get out of here and get to Mount Prospect. If I'm not back in half an hour, take the risk and come looking for me. Daddy, if Bruce is any better, try to bring him with you. Don't worry, Chloe, Rayford said. I'm ahead of you. As soon as Rayford had jogged through the muddy weeds and out of sight, Buck regretted agreeing to stay behind. He had always been a person of action, and as he watched shell-shocked citizens milling about and commiserating, he could hardly stand still. Rayford's heart sank as he came over the rise and saw the hospital. Part of the full height of the structure was still intact, but much of it was rubble. Emergency vehicles surrounded the mess, with white uniformed rescue workers scurrying about. A long stretch of police barrier tape had been stretched around the hospital campus. As Rayford lifted it to duck under, a security guard, weapon ready, ran toward him. Halt, he called out. This is a restricted area. I have clearance, Rayford shouted, waving his ID wallet. Stay right there, the guard hollered. When he got to Rayford, he took the wallet and studied it, comparing the photo to Rayford's face. Wow. Clearance level 2A. You work for Carpathia himself. Rayford nodded. What's your job? Classified. Is he around here? No, and I wouldn't tell you if he was. You're all good, the guard said, and Rayford headed toward what had been the front of the building. He was largely ignored by people too busy to care who did or did not have clearance to be there. Body after body was laid out in a neat row and covered. Any survivors? Rayford asked an emergency medical technician. 3 so far, the man said, all women, 2 nurses and a doctor. They were outside for a smoke. No one inside? We hear voices, the man said, but we haven't gotten to anyone in time yet. Breathing a prayer, Rayford folded his wallet so his ID was facing out. He slid it into his breast pocket. He strode to the makeshift outdoor morgue where several EMTs moved among the remains, lifting sheets and taking notes, trying to reconcile patient and employee lists with body parts and ID bracelets. Help or get out of the way, a heavy-set woman said as she brushed past Rayford. I'm looking for a Bruce Barnes, Rayford said. The woman, whose nameplate read Patricia Devlin, stepped and squinted, cocked her head, and checked her clipboard. She flipped through the 3 top pages, shaking her head. Staff or patient, she asked. Patient. Brought into the emergency room. He was in a coma last we heard. Probably ICU then, she said. Check over there. Patricia pointed to 6 bodies at the end of the row. Just a minute, she added, flipping to yet one more page. Barnes, ICU? Yep, that's where he was. There's still more inside, you know, but ICU was just about vaporized. So he might be here and he might still be inside. If he's out here, hun, he's confirmed dead. If he's still inside, they may never find him. No chance of anybody in ICU? Not so far. Relative? closer than a brother. You want I should check for you? Rayford's face contorted, and he could hardly speak. I'd be grateful. Patricia Devlin moved quickly, surprisingly agile for her size. Her thick white soled shoes were muddy. She knelt by the bodies one by one, checking as Rayford stood 10 feet away, his hand covering his mouth, a sob rising in his throat. At the fourth body, Miss Devlin began to lift the sheet when she hesitated and checked the still intact wristband. She looked back at Rayford, and he knew. The tears began to roll. She rose and approached. Your friend is presentable, she said. Some of these I wouldn't dare show you, but you could see him. Rayford forced himself to put one foot in front of the other. The woman reached down and slowly pulled back the sheet, revealing Bruce, eyes open, lifeless and still. Rayford fought for composure, his chest heaving. He reached to close Bruce's eyes, but the nurse stopped him. I can't let you do that. She reached with a gloved hand. I'll do it. Could you check for a pulse? Rayford managed. Oh, sir, she said, deeply sympathy in her voice. They don't bring them out here unless they've been pronounced. Please, he whispered, crying openly now, for me. And as Rayford stood in the bluster of suburban Chicago's early afternoon, his hands to his face, a woman he had never met before and would never see again, placed a thumb and forefinger at the pressure points under his pastor's jaw. Without looking at Rayford, she took her hand away, replaced the sheet over Bruce Barnes' head, and went back about her business. Rayford's legs buckled, and he knelt on this muddy pavement. Sirens blared in the distance, emergency lights flashed all around him, and his family waited less than half a mile away. It was just him and them now. No teacher, no mentor, just the four of them. As he rose and trudged back down the rise with his awful news, Rayford heard the emergency broadcast system station blaring from every vehicle he passed. Washington had been obliterated. Heathrow was gone. There had been death in the Egyptian desert and in the skies over London. New York was on alert. Buck was nearly ready to go after Rayford when he saw a tall form appear on the horizon. From his gait and the slump of his shoulders, Buck knew. Oh no, he whispered, and Chloe and Amanda began to cry. The three of them rushed to meet Rayford and walk him back to the car. The red horse of the apocalypse was on the rampage. So the end of the book is take heed. It says, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." And that's Matthew 24, 4 through 8. And that is the end of the Tribulation Force, Book 2. Next, we will be starting on Book 3. Thank you for joining me, and have a wonderful day.